YouTube link is, are you asking me something there? Okay. I guess you can ask me questions by that's cool. Interactive. Hi. Hi, Joel. Yeah, so I'll keep paying attention to that. I'll be not distracting at all. All right, awesome. So yeah, we have you captive for the next couple of hours. So we're going to take utmost advantage of that. We'll be doing Sage on the stage, 2 hours of talking. None of you are allowed. We'll try to get into a lot more and try to build a deeper understanding across this whole room of some of the mechanisms and the network science and the implications and potential for integration, and then hopefully that discussion will be sort of continuing all week essentially. So just to open things up, I'm gonna yesterday we did this game. Hopefully you all enjoyed the game. We called the game The Art of Exchange, just to give you a sort of feel of the problem of balancing the payments graph, right? And of course the graph came balanced for you. And so you didn't have to actually do the hard work of balancing the graph yourself. All you had to do was the clearing, right? But there's another side to this. So there's the art of exchange, which is this art of how do we balance the payments graph, and then there's the actual science of payments, of network science and optimizing flows within these graphs. And so I feel like these two things are kind of key to this new world of money and credit that we're all trying to create. There's both an art to it, which I think we all get a sense of, especially in this place, covered in this this beautiful art by your father. Is that right? Thomas, right? Very nice. And so there's an art to to money and credit, but there's also a science to it. And we don't want to we can't lose sight of the fact that there's both of these things. And so we'll cover a little bit of both of them. But first, I just want to touch on why money? Why did Paulo voice the extreme position yesterday that money is this like fundamental problem for human society, and why are we all, or at least us, so obsessed with this problem of money? For me, at least, I think about sustainable systems in terms of biophysics and information theory, and the idea that a sustainable system is one that has an effective representation of its environment. So internally within its structure, it encodes the environmental signals that drive it, right? We're talking about non-equilibrium systems, and everything, yesterday we talked about the second law of thermodynamics. Everything is running down in this universe. And if you want to not run down, then you better have a model of where energy is coming from so that you can take advantage of it and sort of build yourself up, right? And so that's what human beings and all these other organisms are doing. They encode internally in their structure models of the environment so that they can respond to and capture energy and store it up to be able to use it later. And what's interesting about money and the payments graph is it seems like that is one of the primary places where we as a society encode our world, is in the payments graph, in the in all the, that's sort of a representation of all the activities we engage in. And I would argue, and I'm sure many of you would agree, that we do a really terrible job right now of actually representing the world we're embedded in and encoding it correctly, and that's leading quite directly to our unsustainability and demise. And so maybe if we can correct that representation a little bit, it's, as Matt was saying yesterday, it might be a necessary but not sufficient step to towards a more sustainable future. And so this is why we've really honed in on this problem of the payments graph and the sort of network science and seeing what we can do to actually correct this representation of the world, and in particular try to make explicit this problem of circular flows, because so much of what's happening in organisms and sustainable systems are circular flows. You have a driving signal, you have energy from the sun, it's coming into the earth, and it's going to bounce out. And what is it going to do on Earth? If you want it to do something interesting, you have to trap it and make it move in cycles, right? And that's what's happening inside all of us, is you try to get the energy to flow in cycles before it dissipates out, right? And so we want to do the same thing with the payments graph, is try to trap the energy in cycles so that it can move in these loops before it's ultimately dissipated into some kind of imbalance. And maybe from that we can build up a sort of foundation of sustainability. It appears I've upset Grace, so that's okay. Okay, so we will let's keep going. So just briefly on the problems of money. I like to say, if home is where the heart is, money is where the payments are. I've been sort of formulating the problem of money as money being for payments. It is for denominating and discharging debt, and we can understand the functions of money in terms of that. The unit of account is for denominating debt, the medium of exchange for discharging debt here and now, store of value for discharging debt elsewhere and later. And I found that framing, helpful, at least for me in understanding all these things. But then we get to money and credit. Yesterday we were talking about the credit theory of money, and there's definitely a distinction between money and credit. Some people want to argue that all money is credit, or certainly it's not the case that all credit is money. I might extend some credit to you. It's not clear that you're going to be able to use that to pay someone else, right? As I forget who said it, someone said, I think it might have been Minsky. It's easy to create money. The problem is getting people to accept it, right? And so the key, though, is that money is really only needed so long as there are imbalances in the payments graph. Right. So if there are no imbalances, and then you can all sort of net out your credits with each other, you don't really need any money. Right. And so money arises from this problem of imbalance. And if we can focus on the problem of balance and actually map it out and make it explicit, we might get a better understanding of how much money do we actually need. This is sort of this open question, right? Central banks are running amok, sort of printing all these reserves, and what are they for? They're thinking about this sort of quantity theory of money. Oh, we need more and more, of these tangible units. But do they actually, right? And so we want to move towards a quality theory, and arguably the sort of quality theory is going to be based in structures in the network and these cycles in particular. That's at least how we're thinking about it. This also sets up this distinction. The difference between money and credit also sort of sets up a distinction between clearing and settlement, right? So clearing is what we can do if there's balance. If we don't need money, right, we can offset our debts with each other. Whereas settlement is what we need to do with the leftover balances, right? We have to actually make a payment. So why are these imbalances there in the first place, right? I mean, why can't it all be sort of hunky-dory and clean and circular? Seems like maybe a naive question. You might ask, well, why should there be balances at all? But what we want to do is actually expose where the balances are so that we can work towards more balance, developing this art of balancing the graph. Of course, the existence of the imbalances reflect these structures of power and production, and so we can't be naive to the existence of power and the very powerful sort of states and interests that we're up against. But maybe by exposing these things and working together and collaborating, we can start to work up against that. So. I'm not going to bore you with too much history, but I'm sure many of you know this. The problem of balancing the payments graph hasn't been completely lost to history, right? We talked yesterday about the exchange fairs of the 16th century. They were balancing the graph not out of the goodness of their heart, but because they were able to systematically profit. It seems like there might have been some kind of harmony to them being able to extract that profit through balance. We want to figure out how to balance the graph, through some other means. That balance came to an end. The Spanish Genoese alliance sort of entrenched a systematic imbalance that we've been suffering from ever since. But in the 20th century, we've seen a few efforts, especially from Europeans, to assert that, hey, we need to rebalance the graph. And Bancor, the proposal at Bretton Woods, which is based on E.F. Schumacher's work. I don't know how many people know that Keynes was actually very indebted to E.F. Schumacher's work on multilateral clearing. Bancor was a proposal to balance the payments graph. After Bretton Woods, Europe was failing to recover. Matt turned me on to this awesome book, The End of Finance, which has an awesome chapter on the European Payments Union, which was set up in 1950 because the countries of Europe were basically, there wasn't enough money to go around. There was all these like Byzantine bilateral relations. So they set up a multilateral clearing system that allowed them to rebound. And by the end of the decade, it was so successful that these idiots shut it down. They were like, we don't need it anymore because we succeeded in recovering. Now we can use U.S. dollars because now we're mature enough to use these dollars. And of course, almost immediately it's replaced by the Eurodollar system, right? And we've been basically enslaved to the Eurodollar system for the last 50 years or so. And that thing catastrophically collapsed in 2008, and now no one really knows what kind of state we're in. We're in this nebulous world of really broken banking, and we're seeing banks fail all around us. Probably more coming, and no one really knows what to do about it. So hopefully, in this room, we're gonna kind of figure that out and chart a course forward. But we need both the art and the science. Oh, so this is supposed to be me when I get really worked up about talking about international finance, but I saved you some of that because we've been through it, and you know a lot of this. So this was really from when I was preaching to the crypto bros. Sorry, I'm going to say crypto like my esteemed colleague Pepe here. But I got really worked up about the international finance, and so I threw in this slide. All right. So let's talk about the science of payments a little bit, because this is, I think this is some of the more interesting stuff we're working on, is really the actual like network science and what it takes to, to find the cycles and do something about it, and what you do with the stuff that's not in cycles, and that's, I think, one of the most interesting questions that allows the kind of work we're doing to connect to a lot of the work others in the room are doing around mutual credit and mesh credit and all these other sort of interesting mechanisms. So the way we were sort of framing this problem is that most of economics is blind to liquidity and the problems of the payments graph. Economics, sort of ironically, it grew up in parallel to a very advanced banking system, but it was almost blind to what was happening in the banking system, and emerged in terms of theorizing about mutual gains to trade, where trade was conceived as this, like, as barter, essentially, right? And so they sort of ignored the temporal dimension of all of this and the credit component of all of this, and basically became blind to the problem of liquidity, where liquidity is really a fundamental constraint of the payments graph, derives from the imbalances in the payments graph and the need to settle your debts at the end of the day. Bless you. And so the way, we sort of mentioned this yesterday, is the sort of meaning of, what do we mean by collaborative finance? The goal is to move us from a theory based on game theory to one based on graph theory, right? To move from this sort of logic of rational, selfish agents all competing with each other to one, that's not just like, oh, we're all just gonna, kumbaya and hold hands and everything will be nice, but that there's actually a rational theory that we can use and incept the academics with, potentially, and that's graph theory and network science. And there's a lot we can actually do with that very concretely and apply it to economics and monetary economics in particular. And one of the main things you sort of get out of that, and again, we sort of touched on this yesterday, is that banks are already taking advantage of these mechanisms between themselves. Every day, the banks are doing clearing. At the end of the day, they gather at these clearing houses, they net out all their balances, and they save themselves trillions and trillions of dollars in liquidity, right? But these mechanisms are only available to them, right? So what about the rest of us? Why should the banks get to do all the clearing? Why should they get to have all the fun? We're not going to settle for that. I failed to deliver that joke the last time I gave this, and someone came up to me and was like, I'm so disappointed. And it was like, you better do this next time. So thank you for humoring me. Okay, so let's try to put this all together, just sort of at a high level: bankers, blockchains, and CoFi. So the bankers come around and say, look, okay, we're going to do the clearing ourselves, and all of you are only going to get settlement, right? So it's a settlement for thee, clearing for me. Everyone has to use our settlement rails, and they're going to have to pay us and whatever, and we're going to get to do all this liquidity saving and benefit from our trusted networks between ourselves. We have a lot of trust between the banks. We'll benefit from that. Everyone else can kind of fuck off and use our rails, and we're not going to let them benefit from the trust that they might have in their own communities, right? And then blockchains come along and say, look at all these bankers taking advantage of all this trust. Let's abolish trust, and let's just expose settlement for everyone, right? Open settlement for everyone. So now it's not dependent on the bankers. Everyone gets settlement, but this trust thing, that's too dangerous. We're not going to mess with that. Just open settlement for everyone. And the idea behind CoFi is to say, wait a minute, this trust stuff is really important. There's deep networks of trust all over the world that we should be able to expose and take advantage of. So let's put these things together. Let's do what the blockchains are doing, which are opening settlement for everyone, but let's also bring that to clearing, right? So clearing and settlement for everyone, right? That's kind of the goal here. Okay, so to get into the meat, and this will set up hopefully the intuition for the rest of the session, and then Paulo's going to talk a little bit about mutual credit in particular, just to sort of tease the impact, because I think there's going to be a whole day on mutual credit, so that will be really interesting. So you all experienced this problem yesterday when you played the game. If there is a loop, you can clear the minimum amount in the loop. In this case, it's 600. So we take 600 off, and we're left over with this, right? Now, yesterday, you were able to clear everything, so there were no chains left over. But what do you do when you're left with a chain, right? So after you clear a loop, you're left with a chain. If the chain's not in any other loops, it's sort of, okay, great, you're able to clear cycles, but like, now what, right? So now you need to introduce money. So there's an imbalance in this graph, right? So we had credit, we were able to do something about the credit so long as it was balanced. Now it's imbalanced, so now we need to introduce money, right? And so we call that a liquidity provider. the liquidity needs to enter the system somehow. And the question is, where does that liquidity come from, right? And how much of it do we need? And this is where things get really interesting, and where we're going to connect with all the other mechanisms that are being worked on by everyone in this room, because there's different places this liquidity can come from, right? So Purple owes $400 and Blue owes $200, right? So naively you could say, well, we're going to need $600 of money because there's $600 in debt here, right? But as I'm sure you can realize, you really only need 400, because if Purple takes 400 and pays Blue, then Blue can take 200 of that and pay Yellow, right? So we can minimize the amount of debt we needed. Of course, the amount of money we need. Of course, we started here. We would think we might need, $2,400, but we need much less than that. Turns out we actually only need $400 to clear all of this, right? But so where does this $400 come from? Well, Purple might have $400 in their pocket. We call that internal liquidity, right? That's money already available to Purple in their pocket, and they can take that out and they can pay Blue. Maybe Purple doesn't have the money in their pocket, but they have access to a loan. So they can get a loan from a bank or from some fund or something. We'll call that external liquidity, right? And again, that's a viable source. That's a viable source of liquidity that can be used to clear things. But what we want to do is minimize the amount of not just liquidity in general, but especially external liquidity that must enter the network, because that's a sign that there's sort of not enough trust or not enough value already existing in the network to clear all its debts when you have to access this sort of external liquidity, right? So it's one thing to reach into your pocket and take out, this money, the dollars or Bitcoin that you might use to discharge this. It's another to have to get a loan from someone else, right? Now, both of those mechanisms are acceptable. In both cases, we want to minimize the amount of money being used, but we want to pay attention to this distinction between internal and external liquidity, because another possible source of internal liquidity is actually mutual credit. Right. And that's one of the sort of profound realizations of the initial sort of Ko-Fi paper, was that you can use mutual credit as a liquidity injection mechanism, right, to optimize, to minimize the amount of liquidity the amount of money that's actually needed to discharge all these debts. And so that's the sort of high level intuition behind how this sort of credit clearing stuff connects to everything else, and what you can use the same mechanisms of graph theory and network science to find the loops and clear them as you do to find out how much liquidity needs to enter the system, whether that liquidity comes from mutual credit, whether it comes from crypto, whether it comes from dollars, or what have you. Right. And so we sort of represent that schematically here. Now, one thing I didn't mention is all this debt is denominated in dollars, but you can use any medium to discharge it so long as someone's willing to accept it, right? And so say Purple wants to pay in Bitcoin, Yellow's willing to accept Bitcoin, but Blue doesn't want anything to do with Bitcoin, right? So normally you'd be screwed. But if you can view the network and you can view the different preferences in the network, you can use $200 worth of Bitcoin from Purple to pay Yellow, and another $200 of dollars to pay Blue, and now everyone is settled, and you were able to optimize not just over the amount of liquidity, but over people's respective preferences for what kind of liquidity they're using, right? Which again exposes a lot more potential to use sort of different currencies and different mechanisms to make liquidity available. So just to summarize, we have a network. You're used to us talking about clearing cycles in the network, but what we do is basically introduce additional nodes into the network that we call liquidity nodes that connect to all the other nodes in the network. So imagine every node in the network, like the 5 circles in the network from yesterday, was also connected to a liquidity source. And we differentiate these sort of four nodes within a liquidity source. 2 are the outflow, 2 are the inflow, right? So liquidity going out, liquidity coming back in. And we also differentiate between the sort of internal and external liquidity going out and coming back in, right? So internal liquidity, that's again, money in your pocket. External liquidity is money you get as a loan. And then, you repay your loans and you put money back in your pocket, right? So money in my pocket that gets paid out as internal liquidity becomes money in someone else's pocket when they receive it, right? But by representing it as a node, you can connect it up to the rest of the graph and use the same techniques of graph theory and network science to optimize liquidity flows, right? So any kind of mechanism can be used as a liquidity source, even if it's just bilateral mesh credit, right? Which opens up really profound ways to start to optimize liquidity across these graphs and connect to, again, all the other mechanisms folks are working on. So ultimately, you end up with a sort of pretty graph like this, where you have different, there's the network in the middle of nodes, and then you have different liquidity sources, right? We have fiat in the upper left, crypto in the right, mutual credit down here. You could have many more, and you can inject these different sources into the network and use them to optimize, to discharge debt, where, again, the goal is to use the least amount of money to discharge the most amount of debt in a way that optimizes for people's preferences of which currencies they actually use. And so even if you have people that don't want anything to do with crypto, the existence of crypto as a liquidity source in the network can actually benefit them without them even having to know about it, right? And same for mutual credit, right? The existence of mutual credit in the network can benefit people who don't care about mutual credit, right? So long as they're connected to someone who does. And that really starts to open the scope of possibilities for how all these different mechanisms everyone's working on can start to fit together. That's basically it. I'm not going to talk too much about the roadmap or the architecture. We can go into that. If people are interested, we can ask questions. We sort of want to open it up. I'm going to let, there's lots more information. I blog about this stuff, so you can read that. But also we have a little, a very academic looking website. So it's mostly there to scare people away if they're not ready for the stuff, but you're all ready for it. So you can parse that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Paula, who will talk a little bit about mutual and try to really get the discussions going. Yeah. How do I turn it over? Negative. Cool.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a different style. I'm going to sit down. And I have quite a few things to say. So, test. That one, not the notes. You can cut the notes. Yeah, the notes I've got here. No. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So my talk is about collaborative finance for sustainability. To understand what that means, next slide, please. Collaborative finance for sustainability. To understand what that means, next slide, please. We begin by recognizing that money can be understood in two different ways, either as a social relation of credit and debt, or as a commodity or asset. In the first case, it works best as a unit of account. In the second, it supports all three functions of money: unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. In this talk, I focus more on the first. Next. A good example of money as a social relation is provided by mutual credit, where the credits are issued by a participant in mutual credit circuit going into debt by the same amount as the amount issued. In other words, mutual credit distributes the power to create money to the circuit members. That's a quotation from Giuseppe. Next, please. A consequence of this creation mechanism is that when a member with a positive balance buys from a member with a negative balance, the money used to pay is destroyed. Therefore, mutual credit is a circular currency: create, spend, destroy, create again, etc. Next. How big is Sardex? This diagram shows that about 28 million euros were spent on the island of Sardinia in 6 different business sectors, or between them, with retail and services the largest. Next. Over time, we can see that in 2017, Sardex had about 2,800 members. That's the orange curve on the left. The yellow curve is the employees who agreed to receive part of their salaries in credits. The B2B transactions volume shows about 28 million for 2017. The B2E, business to employee volume, is the sum of the employee salaries plus what they spent with those credits. The total was about 40 million euros. This is nice, but it has a pretty small macroeconomic impact, fractions of 1% of Sardinian GDP. Next. Multilateral trade credit set-off, or MTCS, on the other hand, can have a pretty large impact. MTCS is an algorithm that looks for closed cycles of invoices in an obligation network and subtracts the smallest amount from each cycle. An obligation network is a set of bilateral debts, invoices, for example, between n counterparties. For example, if I owe you 100 and you owe me 50, we can talk about it. I send you 50 and we're done. MTCS generalizes this idea to 3 or more counterparties as long as their obligations form a directed cycle. So in this cycle, we can subtract the smallest amount of 20 units here on the left without affecting the net positions of the firms involved. On the right, you can see that A was at -10 before set-off and is still at -10 after set-off, and so on. Therefore, set-off can be performed without the use of any liquidity. It simply decreases the debt burden across the network. It decreases the size of the balance sheets of the affected companies and therefore the individual and overall risk. How large an effect is this? Next. We performed a simulation with Sardex data, meaning that we took the transaction data from May 2019 and pretended it was invoices that had yet to be paid. This shows 12,302 invoices between approximately 3,200 companies. That's the dots. All of the dots are 3,200 companies. How many cycles were there? How much could be set off? Next. The answer is about 5,600, or 45% of the invoices were in cycles, involving a bit more than 1/3 of all the companies. Cycles can be very long and complex, as shown in this visualization. These figures were created by Tomasz, by the way, and who's fantastic at these kinds of visualizations, in addition to the actual computation. Next, please. The volume for May 2019 was 2.8 million euros, of which about 690K were set off, or about 25%. This is pretty large. Next. Depending on how closed or open an economy is, this number can change quite a lot, as shown in this graph summarizing additional simulations. For example, in a Kenyan village, most of the trades are internal to the village. It is a closed economy. In this case, the amount set off is about 80% of total debt, where total debt is just a sum of all the invoices. For the Sardex economy, it's about 25%, as we saw. And for a data set of 35,000 Italian companies, is about 8%, which corresponds to about 100 million euros cleared without liquidity over 1 month. I should again say that all of these simulations were performed by Tomasz. Now, since there are about 3.5 million SMEs in Italy, if we extrapolate these numbers, we get 100 million times 12 times 100 is 120 billion euros that can be cleared. That's on the order of 3 to 5% of Italian GDP. So that's about the same order of magnitude as the Stability and Growth Pact deficit ceiling. So it's pretty significant. These two empirical case studies are examples of collaborative finance because some level of mutual trust and collaboration is needed to unlock economic value that would have remained out of the reach of selfish rational agents. Next, please. Let's now take a step back and see the theoretical implications. The main one is that money is not a neutral instrument. According to neoclassical economics, money is a neutral instrument because an increase in monetary mass affects only prices without influencing real economic output. But money does not affect only economic factors, it also affects the lives of people, meaning that whether it is neutral or not depends in part on the subjective disciplinary point of view. However, if we include also money creation by banks, then the decision of whether or not to issue a loan does not affect only the lives of people, it also affects the real economy. So I think it is fair to say that money is not neutral on objective grounds and not just on subjective disciplinary viewpoints. Next. The consequence of the non-neutrality of money is that depending on the design of the monetary instrument, different kinds of finance and economies will be supported. In each case, best supported by different mathematical theories. For example, money as a commodity is effective at supporting extractive finance, which is consistent with neoclassical economics and underpinned by game theory. By contrast, money as a social relation is the best kind of instrument to support collaborative finance, or COFI, which is compatible with the view of economic anthropology, which views economy as composed of 4 domains of value: market, capital, social relationships, and the commons. In other words, social relationships and the commons are not outside the economy. They are important centers of value creation on par with market and capital, as amply demonstrated by the open source phenomenon over the past 40 years. This framework is underpinned by graph theory. Now, clearly, we can't just dispose of investment capital, which is essential to entrepreneurship. And we definitely need to support working capital and the circular economy. Therefore, we need a sustainable synthesis between these two different ways of organizing our economic, financial, and monetary systems. Next. The final slide shows how the economy of economic anthropology, where you can see the 4 domains of value here, red is capital, yellow is market, blue is social relations, and green is commons, can be visualized in increasing order of abstraction of value along the y-axis and in terms of scale from local to global along the x-axis. In this depiction, money as a social relation is most effective in the lower left part of the figure, whereas money as a commodity is dominant in the upper right. The problem is that in the current system, there is a vacuum or suction effect from the financial economy that depletes all the other domains by turning everything into money. And I can quote Eisenstein, Marx, Braudel. Quite a few people have said something similar to this. Mutual credit acts as a protective barrier, and here I'm quoting Thomas Greco, I believe, he was the first to say this, against the suction of financial capitalism, as long as it is non-convertible, in other words, non-securitizable. Whereas MTCS promises to act as a bridge. And here's kind of the really nice message. The reason is that MTCS acts on the unit of account, and therefore it is agnostic as to the kind of money it operates on, or on the scale it operates at. It is equally effective everywhere. However, it still requires a significant level of cooperation and trust. So it has the potential to right the balance and demonstrate a different way of thinking. Another way to say this is that we have more or less understood how to tackle the lower boundary of Kate Raworth's donut. I'm not sure if you're familiar with donut economics, but we're still struggling with the upper boundary. How to access the power of capitalism in a sustainable way. Right now, capitalism acts like a black hole. You get too close and it sucks you in and you never get out. Clearly, greater monetary literacy is needed. If I had improvised that, it would have taken an hour. That's why I read. No, I don't know if you had any questions about this or about Ethan. You know, we can do some.
We have lots of material, but we didn't want to just talk for 3 hours. So,
yeah.
My question is maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about the elaborate more about the financial effects and advantages of actual clearing that support the economy.
Sorry, how the financial what?
How does the clearing of debts, like how does it improve how everything works?
Okay, well, basically it helps mainly the companies that are less stable or close to bankruptcy, the ones that are more vulnerable to cash flow fluctuations, because if they have debts that are, you know, coming due, that and if they're waiting to be paid in order to pay their own creditors, they might not make it on time and they might go bankrupt. If we reduce the debt load for everyone, we increase the probability that they will be able to repay whatever is left out of the set, you know, after the set of notices.
I have a question while I go to Josh. What is CoFi? In practice, it would be like a software stack or a set of tools to payment graphs? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, well, then we can talk about. So in Slovenia, there's a system that Tomasz worked on where the government runs a piece of software that allows all the businesses in the country to submit their invoices to the government. The government runs an algorithm to find all the loops. It takes the minimum amount from all the loops, calls that a set-off notice, and sends those notices back to all the businesses. So at the end of the day, you submitted an, you know, effectively it's like you submitted an invoice to the government and the government sends you your invoice back with potentially a lower amount. So now the amount you owe and the amount you are owed has gone down, right? And that's the sort of default baseline. So we're re-implementing that system, but in a optimized way using modern techniques that are going to be privacy preserving. And we want to build it on a blockchain substrate so that we can access not just the clearing of cycles, but actually injecting liquidity from different sources, because we want to be able to clear everything as much as possible, not just what's in loops, right? Like Paula was saying, some significant fraction of debt is actually in loops. In developed economies, it's 5%, maybe up to 20%. In less developed economies, it goes even higher, up to 80% or so. But what do you do with everything left over, right? You still want to discharge that debt, and you want to do it with the least amount of money. And so by still using the same algorithms, the same mechanisms from graph theory that you apply to clear these loops. You can use those same mechanisms to find out the least amount of money needed and where it needs to enter the system to discharge the maximum amount of debt, right? And if you compare that to like what central banks are doing with sort of quantitative easing, where they just like, expand their balance sheet and the money just goes to banks, and it's sort of like a blunt hammer. They have no idea how it gets into the real economy. It turns out it doesn't seem to get into the real economy at all, right? This is more like a precision injection of liquidity exactly where it needs to go to optimize, to discharge the most amount of debt. And that sort of also relates to Hadar's question of how this kind of relates to the larger financial system, is that you can use this as a substrate to inject liquidity from any source, right? So it could be banks that are injecting dollars through loans, and it benefits them because now they're lending to the network rather than lending to an individual. They're lending, they're able to somewhat actually reduce their credit risk. They have more information they can depend on, right? And more people might be eligible that weren't eligible before because there's sort of more mitigating factors in the risk calculus. Yeah. Yeah.
Ethan mentioned quantitative easing. On this diagram, QE is up here. It's injection at the top. Okay? You can see that that's not going to help people down here very much because the flow is up anyway. People up here are going to reinvest in the financial economy. It's never going to get down here. Now, central banks know that this transmission channel is broken. They don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to fix it. All they know is that if they don't keep this alive, the whole castle of cards will just collapse. So they have to maintain unsustainable inequality, unsustainable depletion of social and environmental aspects, because otherwise it's mayhem, and otherwise it's the end of civilization. So it's that serious. What? Yeah, it's a matter of how long, okay? And so we are in a hurry here to try and find a solution.
Question here, it was in the line.
Hi, my impression is that the way this is interesting and a political has political implications, because without this whole clearing system right now, money or debts get accumulated at the top, and that's like a power relationship from I don't know, if people buying a shit ton of stuff from corporations, owes a lot to them. If you could clear a lot of that debt, then that reduces the power relation between those who are able to accumulate and those who cannot. And because there is no system of seeing where the debts can be cleared, they just the quantified difference of the debts are bigger, and this clearing would then reduce that. Is that
not
a proper
quite.
understanding?
Let me try, and then maybe you can add to it. You want to answer that?
So I think an answer to your point would be that indeed it changes the power relations, because right now banks do enjoy the benefits of netting and clearing among themselves. Their clients don't. So if we were all companies and we might owe 100 different banks, the banks enjoy their loan book is bigger. Everybody's happier with bigger numbers in the upper realm of funny numbers. And in that regard, we're trying to protect. The idea is to actually, the algorithm can work with different parameters. I was telling him that you can have a knob and choose for an optimal distribution. Thomas, correct me then maybe later. So to get the benefit to the most people or the highest amount of liquidity saved. So you can tweak. But the whole point is we're trying to reduce gridlocks in the economy. That was the main point, and dependency. And
right. Grid. What's the difference?
Both of them, yeah. Right.
But I think it's this gridlock that also gives power to those at the top, that they have the power to stop, to stall the economy in ways to then they say, oh, sorry, we don't have capital, we need to reduce your wages. Oh, sorry, you're all unemployed. Oh, now it's really cheap to employ you. Oh, we made more money. Wow, how did that happen?
Well, and another point is that in addition to the banks, the derivatives are cleared in a similar way. And as Tomasz explained to me, the real-time gross settlement systems clear every 15 seconds. Okay, so all of these instruments are being used at the top already.
Right.
And it hasn't been helping the people at the bottom very much. Okay, so what we're
Sure,
doing is
sure.
trying to introduce these instruments, the sophisticated financial instruments, lower down so that they can help the real economy and help the sustainability.
It
aspect.
seems to me like they know the power of, like, I guess, like a capital strike. Like the gridlock kind of acts as a capital strike, and because they're the ones at the top who are able to do capital strikes, they're like, we're not going to do it against each other, but like everyone else, yeah, fuck them.
Hold on, Scott has a question.
I just wanted to ask, and this may be a different part of the presentation, but excellent. So what now? Right? We do the what, so what now?
Well, yeah, I mean, so we're saying we know more or less what to do down here, right? To help this part. The problem is we don't have, I don't think, a plausible strategy to approach the investment part in a way that doesn't get us sucked into financial capital. Can we do Keynesian capital? Can we, Schumpeterian capital? Can we help entrepreneurship without empowering rentiers?
I believe so. Happy to talk about that.
In principle, yes. How? Okay, we need ideas here. Yes, I think X is going to
Guys,
help us
there's
understand
also-
that later today.
There's also a question online. Do we want to answer to the question online, and then we come back to the real world, so that people in the web are happy?
Oh, okay, sure.
We have Raffaele Izza from Rifai, Italy. Ciao, Raffaele. How are you? Besides local community currencies, what are the other small-scale implementations of CoFi? And while it's good to think about the implication on the global system, I would like to hear something more applicable on the lower scale. So local applications of CoFi.
Tomasz, Slovenia?
I mean, thanks for the question. I mean, we're really getting started. So on our end, like, we still have a lot to do. As for local implementation that you can see, there's plenty that could be categorized as CoFi. I mean, I can mention Sardex, but there's tons of other mutual credit systems. There's VIR, there's and those are concrete examples. They're being running some time. Is that enough? No. Is that the best we can do? No. We need to do better. What was the second part of the question? Oh.
Okay. So implementation of this life. So using the idea of doing any kind of clearing and settlement locally is very appealing. But there is one thing that is working against this idea. And this is the fact that our lives, we want to live comfortably. So we like to eat bananas, we like to drink coffee, we like to have cheap clothing, we would like to have battery cars where batteries come from China again. So our lives are global and no one can really deny it. And every community that tries to do everything locally will come into a problem that they cannot balance everything locally. It's impossible because the material flows, the flows of value, the flows of everything are global. We need to understand that we are all connected. Everyone is connected to everyone. Some connections might be very thin, very fragile, but they are there and they create the imbalances. So what is the problem? The problem is we are all very introverted in terms of money and values. We cherish what we own and we are unable to see these connections. We don't see them. And then this is why the global monetary system that actually sees these connections is basically taking advantage of us. And they are using the network science, they use it to provide us with the means to settle our global relationships. So the whole idea of COFI is to recognize this simple fact that we are all together. There is no local community. We are global, universal, whatever. Yes, local is closer. In locally, we have more trust. If we understand this, then we can use this trust locally to diminish the power of global forces on us, to regulate, to balance our relationship with the world. This is the COFI. And what we see in the current project is, okay, locally, sustainably, locally. First is enthusiasm, yeah, win, local. And then, nothing. Why? Because there is no empty CS. Nobody clears with the world. We need to do this. Yeah. So I try to simplify the problem so we can go in more details, and you cannot stop me when I start, so I will give.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Tomasz. So maybe just to go a bit deeper there, thinking politically and the political economy we're in, what are the strategies? No, I think it's important to ask this question collectively. So is it going to municipalities? Is it going to autonomous governments? Which afternoon we will have examples of today. So I welcome everyone to come to Cameron and Lucia's presentation. It's and thank you, Matthew. And my question is this: like, how to go there politically? Is it talking to the mayors, getting the currencies accepted as a payment for utilities? What are the strategies that you have been thinking of, tactically, practically, strategically, to find this balance?
Can I turn it back to all of you? Well, let's hear what you guys think. What is the strategies for doing this? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one. I'm working on a system called Connect Your Books, where you connect to the bookkeeping systems of people to make so all these different, like 60 different types of bookkeeping software. If you get some plugins into that, where people can easily interface with the invoices they have there already, that'll make it easier to make this take off, I think.
I think a big strategy is much more simplified language and marketing. I mean, obviously not for us here because we're here to dig into the details, but for the majority of people, the amount of education to be able to participate in these types of discussions and also the time that people have, right? We don't really have a lot of bridges to the everyday world. So I think we need a huge marketing and communications effort.
I would also add that the best strategy is being useful and valuable. If you're really useful and valuable and you solve people's problems, they will come to you. We won't have to come to them. But I have a question for you, if I may. Okay. Yeah. How would you use your insights here to, if at all, to design a sovereign currency? What is the ideal sovereign currency? Is that too large for now? Different session. Okay.
I was gonna say I don't know. We're still working on it, but I want to hear more answers. Did you guys have one?
I have a question that's kind of, I don't want to take away the discussion.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. Yeah,
I'm happy to wait.
More answers to
thank you. Because of resistance that we've encountered at the Hudson Valley Current since 2014, I agree that the simplified resistance from people who are potentially going to sign up. They don't understand it enough, so simplifying our message is really important. And then coming up with new ideas. Exactly. Our new slogan is "It's just money," and it helps people think about it much faster. But also, I create strategies like I became a county legislator, and I'm working on getting part of my salary in currents with 4 other legislators. And the county executive asked us, "Do we have to do this?" So she's thinking about it, but it's in the works. And then we can pay taxes, fees, and permits to the county, and then it would be a full circle.
The county's already accepting?
We're working on that now.
That's the holy grail. If you can get the tax
So I'll give an example from my country, which I think might be interesting. Possible strategy, Czech Republic. So they are updating the strategic framework for sustainability 2030, and they are updating also the section on economics and digitalization. And because there was the UN report on harnessing digitalization in finance for like driving sustainability, they are already looking into kind of citizen finance use case stuff. And since also at the same time, there were like crises hitting the municipalities. So the first examples of like very simple schemes where they're trying to inject liquidity to towns through majors are already like springing up. And so we have a chance, at least this is the little bubble in Czech, to kind of bring those research into the strategic framework research kind of document, and it can actually get somehow reflected there. And so I would like to use this to invite anyone who would like to help me with this, because we are doing the research. But I think this might also be a pathway or sort of.
That's great. Yeah. Cities seem to definitely be very, very promising. We see, after the Depression in 2008, like cities popping up issuing script. So they tend to get stamped out, but if they have local support, that's right. Is there a resource where we can sort of learn more about this kind of stuff? We shared in the. Okay, great. Yeah, that'd be great.
So as a strategy, a very short answer that is already been implied with a couple of the other answers is like, once we have a shared grammar, a shared language, and that once we've detected the importance of interoperability across ledgers, is to represent this as protocol so we can share the protocol. This will really allow it to scale. So just basically sharing the protocol.
Yeah, I could continue maybe a little bit because what Paolo said, I think it's precisely right. That kind of we need. Oh, I mean, if you look at the history, so after the 16th century bills of exchange, like what happened then? Like what happened to the in the banking system, kind of where it started to evolve from this like a funding trade. Over the next 300 years, it was the capital into the investment, like this mode of production of capitalism. That's where the money started to go, and kind of we are thinking that should happen next here too. Could we use the same kind of network understanding and take it to the investment side? Yeah, because that's where you get to the value question.
One of the interesting things about that this point that this book, the Boyer-Zambo book, makes about the 16th century is that the collapse of this system of bills of exchange seems to have been due to the privilege of seigniorage, right? So the fact that a currency was valued more highly in one location than another actually generated the instability. And this is something I'm still wrestling with, because we're all like, oh, local currencies, we should be able to issue our sovereign things, but the sovereignty has a price, right? And MMT is all like, oh, sovereignty kind of comes for free or whatever. But the banking cartels are going to spring up no matter what, and they're going to question it and try to take advantage of it. And I don't know that we have answers for exactly what to do about that, quite yet. I mean, maybe some people do, but
yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, because when during the presentation, I was thinking about the reduction for the need for liquidity is in effect a cheapening of money, right? I mean, so the whole product here is an arbitrage on money. And if we think about this as an arbitrage on money, then that innovation has potentially an incredible value. So who does it belong to, right? I mean, so how do we think
everyone.
Well, you would hope so, right? I mean, that would be the idea. The idea would be that the innovation is actually distributed equally throughout the socius and shared collectively. But then that goes to your question about the interface, right? Is it the municipality? How does one sort of integrate with a system that can do the netting and clearing that you're talking about? And so the sharing of the innovation means also an equity model, right? How do you share the equity in the infrastructure, which can actually cheapen money?
So there's a Maybe we'll get into this a little later. Did you want to say something? Yeah, well, yeah. I'll come back over here. I just want to address one thing there, which is so something we haven't really got into is that, and I'm not sure if any of you experienced it yesterday. Did any of you experience the tension between clearing one loop or another yesterday during the game? I mean, a lot of you seem to be just trying to map out the global solution because you're all experts, and so you just want to solve it all at once. But part of what we were hoping is that you'd experience the tension of like, oh, well, if I go to clear this loop, then I can't clear that loop. Now, it turned out, in the game we designed yesterday, everyone could clear everything at the end, so it didn't matter. But in practice, it does matter because loops can be mutually exclusive. And so that means there needs to be some discretion over whose loops get to be cleared, right? And so there's like a governance problem buried in, because the clearing solutions aren't unique. You could, could be different cycles that get cleared. Whose debts get to get cleared is sort of an open question, right? And so part of the work we're doing in implementing this is exposing that decision-making to different mechanisms of governance or randomness or whatever it might be. But it could be that ultimately it's up to the sort of municipality or however the thing is governed to decide, okay, we're going to privilege the nonprofits or we're going to privilege the more local organizations so that they get to clear their debts first before we move onto others. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to try and do this without creating a feedback loop that would be very painful. So, I mean, this is a very good question. I actually think you already hit a very crucial note here. Is we have to realize that we are effectively a room full of engineers. I know that we wear different hats and whatnot, but once you hit, Main Street, High Street, you're talking to, regular average Joe America, okay? They're not on this level, and we should not ever expect them to be on this level. Don't expect them to come meet you. We have to go meet them if our goal is to mainstream this quite quickly. So to me, what I've noticed is that when we ask this question and we're the ones answering it, it's very much about the thing. It's about the engine that we're engineering, all right? But the consumer, the customer, cares about where that engine is going to take them, right? They just want to drive the car, right? So the messaging and the value propositions need to be about where that car's going to take them and how it's going to take them farther and more reliably than the systems that we're relying on currently. So what I suspect is that our path to mainstream adoption is around recontextualizing these mechanisms, right? Stacked on one another in whatever way, shape, or form they may be, right? And surfacing those as the right option points around how do we get the thing that we need, and then how do we create the life for ourselves that we want. And these things are appropriately recontextualized as tools that we use to help us get us there, right? But the permanent focus is on the greater why of our community. What is the purpose that we're trying to serve? What is it that we're trying to accomplish or build for ourselves, or the quality of life we're trying to realize, rather than it being about the mechanism itself. That's all.
Could I jump in and ask my question? Because I'm not from the world of monetary theory. I'm from more of like a policy and engineering, like civil engineering world. And when I look at this, I'm fascinated, and I'm so grateful to be learning this. But when I think about my interaction with these systems, with the banking system, when I think about urban sustainability, I'm thinking about housing and land value. And I've done some research as to why in Canada, for example, housing prices are going up so high. And that's how most individuals, not businesses, interact with the financial system. We all get more, well, if we're lucky enough, you get a mortgage and you have to pay back a ton of interest. And that's how individuals interact with this. That's why you have a job, to pay your mortgage, all that, not so much to clear your trade networks. And I think that, yeah, it's gone nuts in Canada, at least, right? And 30% of the economy is related to this very vicious cycle. And so I'm kind of curious to understand, like in terms of connecting with people in local economies, the big piece of the pie that most people interact with financially is around housing, your mortgage, and the bank. And that's to be honest, like how the banks are making their most stable money. Like they're making money hand over fist. And so to think about the systems of power and how to disrupt that, like, does that figure into this at all? Or is that kind of another world?
I've been worried about this for many years. And I felt very depressed for most of that time, because I agree with you. This suction is mostly due to that mortgage interest that you were talking about, okay? If all the debts came due at the same time, the whole financial economic system would collapse, right? It's just engineered wrong. Anyway, the problem is we have no hope of actually changing that system today. It's too powerful, it's too pervasive, it's unbelievably larger than we are. So the approach that we're following, in my opinion, is sort of low-hanging fruit. Let's start where we feel we have an opportunity. Yeah, nibbling at the edges, an opportunity to make a change. The magnitude of that change may remain relatively small, but I think the significance is the impact on the thinking, on the awareness of the possibility of change. So the real goal here is cultural transformation, okay? And we do that by example.
I mean, I agree. Like, you have to change the conventional wisdom. What are people being told? Rich dad, poor dad, or whatever. Like that. I don't know. Like those books where they're like, oh, you have to do this, and everyone is making economic decisions about what jobs to take or what education to do, so that you have some kind of financial security through the form of this indebted, commitment to the system. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. But yeah. Thank you.
So I'm really pleased to hear all of these questions that have been asked, and I really hope that a lot of you can come to our session on Saturday. Tom and I and the much wider collaborative around mutual credit services basically have tasked ourselves with synthesizing all of the questions, with getting the message out, with offering ordinary people immediate things that they can take part in, which give them not a giant benefit, but which are a better choice without them having to become monetary theorists. With connecting together different mechanisms through the Credit Commons Protocol very often, which address different aspects of the economy and allow them to be related together in an ecosystem fashion, so that MTCS, mutual credit, investment can have mutually beneficial feedback loops between them. We're in the total foothills of that work, but that is the job that we've set ourselves, and we'd really like to tell you what we're trying to do about that on Saturday, but I'm not going to jump in on this session and do that. There's a lot of stuff there, but thank you.
Can I say something about the deployment question?
Yes.
Is that cool? Yeah. Still, because I connect with the comment about messaging, about kind of clearer, more simple messaging, and I like to think about. I know we're going to talk about it on Saturday and Sunday, but what we're doing here already, in my mind, is the launching of a CoFi network of practitioners. There's the clearing of the credit in networks, but we're looking around at each other as a nascent CoFi network, and I guess one of the ways I think about deployment is thinking about it in certain areas, like thinking about it, like you talked about, Tomasz, like what this interconnectedness means is that we're not local anymore. So you can do CoFi just in about food systems, like do CoFi in a food system, or do CoFi about co-housing, right? And that makes it also more edible for, for bigger audiences. They say, okay, this is CoFi about food. And then that gathers all its own attention on its own. Then you have CoFi about co-housing or about housing. And then they have basically their own research projects and deploy in specific connection to social problems. Because I think that will also spin back in the media in a really, really powerful way. So,
yeah, I think it's really great that we're dealing with the cultural question as well as sort of like the network and engineering question, because totally right about creating a language for people to access an awareness of CoFi and some of the benefits and sort of on-ramps. But we also want to think about how to move the consumer mentality away from like getting a product and actually engaging in this process of transformation. I mean, this is really a rupture of the financial imagination that we're working on right here. And that's an epic shift in the way in which people will interact with money as they recognize that it's an interface, right? And that it is a fundamental social relation, which we can have increasing control over its operations, its protocols in our terms, right? So that, how do we work that shift? I mean, and keeping in mind that we're not just engaging in a technological improvement, but in a political process, right? I think is a fundamental axiom.
That's a great point. I want to make one point about that, and then do you guys want to break for coffee and then come back? Yeah, please, yeah. Well, just following up on that. I mean, whenever I talk to people about complementary currencies and proliferation, everyone's like, "Oh, that's such a headache. Like, I just want there to be one currency. It's so much simpler, right?" And we're sort of trying to open this Pandora's box of getting people to think about how they denominate value differently, and it's not just all in USD. It's sort of multipolar world. This idea of everything being one currency is actually new in the history of society, right? For so long, there were many currencies, and they flowed in different circuits. And depending on what you were doing, you engaged in different currencies, and arguably created a bunch of instability and led to the system of central banking and so on. But I think this is why actually studying the history and trying to understand what went wrong there, not so that we can go back to some utopian past, but so that we can learn from it for how we engineer the sort of next set of things, and find a way to open this up for people so that it actually works for them and speaks their language, so that it's not just like some ideal that we're trying to impose, like, oh, don't you understand that liquidity injection through multilateral trade is going to be so much better for your cash flow profile, no one's going to understand that, whatever, right? But presumably there are ways to make this accessible to people so that they can they can actually connect with it and resonate it, and arguably that's one of the most sort of meaningful or insightful things happening in the sort of crypto universe, is that people are like, hey, this is a place where, even though it's all so fake and speculative, you are seeing this community building and people expressing their values and identifying in different ways, and so if we can find a way to connect that sort of the real world again, yeah. But then, land continues to be the big elephant in the room, I think for all of us. And, while this money stuff might be necessary but not sufficient, it could be that if we could address the land stuff, that would be sufficient. But I don't think any of us quite know how to do that. And so it's something we'll have to keep coming back to.
I want to make a political theory point that I glossed over before when I was reading the slide. The fact that money is not neutral implies that those layers are not independent. The fact that they're not independent has a consequence, because it opens up a design space. Okay? Now, if we look down here, this has not been designed. This is inherited. Okay? Now, the interesting point here is the system of alibis. Okay? If money is neutral, then this can be defended as the rational way to go. Okay? If money is not neutral, you can start saying, well, this is not quite right. We can think of something better. That's our design space over there. Okay, so part of the struggle here is at the level of ideas. That's why it's important to be both practitioners and thinkers, because we need to question the legitimacy of inherited, paternalistically handed down so-called wisdom that is obviously destroying us and the planet. Okay, so we need to find a better way to make all this work.
Okay, let's break for coffee and then back to it. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.